Financial freedom is in your hands. With CMC Markets' revolutionary new iPad app, you can trade CFDs wherever you are with the leverage you choose. Download now and trade your way. At CMC Markets, your thought counts.
My guest today, Warren Mundine, explains to us that one of the biggest beneficiaries of the mining boom will be the Aboriginal community. And what a change they're going to go through. Billions of dollars will go into the various local communities over the next 30 years. And how they manage that money will play a very big role in the progress of Aboriginal Australia in those next 30 years. In many cases, there has not been enough education, but there are some very good lessons from other parts of the Northern Territory where, say, 20 years ago, Aboriginal communities got a lot of money and frittered it away. This time they're thinking much more seriously of just how this money can transform their communities for the better. And of course, it's not just the money that comes out of the royalties, but Aboriginal communities are becoming very major workers and contractors to these mining projects. And that too is changing their society. Interestingly, the Aboriginal community are one of the greatest pushers for uranium development in Australia. Why? Because they see it can employ their people and bring them even greater wealth. This is a major change in our community, where big sections of the Aboriginal community move from a social service exercise to among the richest people in the country. And of course, the cultural and social problem changes that come with such a dramatic transformation are yet to be played out. Warren, tell me what the Australian Indigenous Chamber of Commerce actually does.
It's an interesting question. We're not a traditional chamber in the sense that they look after businesses and look at industrial relations and a number of other issues. It's more of a peak body in regard to lobbying, ensuring that the environment, government creates the environment for economic development for Indigenous groups, Indigenous community, and how we contribute to the wider Australian economy. So we do a lot of talks and papers and policy-driven stuff on taxation stuff. We do have what I call marriage-type programs where, like for instance, the Chinese are doing a lot of economic development in Australia through mining and other industries. So we bring those major companies together with Indigenous communities and have those chats and negotiations and networking, as well as other companies around Australia and that as well.
We're going to see an enormous change in the Aboriginal people where there's major mining projects. Just how big are some of the deals that have been done with the native title holders in the last 2 or 3 years?
Well, in the last 2 or 3 years, it runs into billions of dollars. You know, in the last 3 weeks, if you have a look in the last 3 weeks, you're looking at what happened at Gove. You know, that's a $700 million direct payment into the Aboriginal community there. And you're looking at you look at the James Price Point, you look at other projects within the Kimberleys, and also the recent announcement in the Pilbara where you're looking at something like $1.2 billion in that. So you're looking at an enormous amount of money in that going into Aboriginal communities, but also in regard to business development. A number of those are looking at contracting for Aboriginal companies, as well as employment. You know, one of the little hidden secrets in Australia is that in the mining industry in Australia is now 5% Aboriginal. Not only in employment but also in contracting and looking at mine ownership, and then the drive for the Mineral Council of Australia is looking at getting it up to 9%. In some of the areas, especially in some of the northern areas in the Pilbara of Western Australia, you can get up to 18 to 25% of Aboriginal employment in business development and so on.
Have we educated the Aboriginal people to take these jobs?
Well, the biggest problem we have is what I call the failure of the education system in Australia. If the education system was run as a company, you have to declare it insolvent and fail. You know, the number of kids that are coming through a high school that are able to then go into university is not enough, and some of it is hidden. You look at some figures, they say there's about 2,500 Aboriginal kids going for year 12. If you look at the statistics that I saw the other day from the university section, only about 22, that's 22 people, not 22%, out of that 2,500 are actually getting the marks to go straight into university. So We've got a massive problem with literacy and numeracy rates. We really have to go back to the womb and start these programs from that to make sure that people are getting the proper education through.
Are you trying to do this?
Well, as a major part of economic development, I'm putting all this in the frame of the economy. One of the things that I found interesting over many years is that when we tended to talk about who's going to run the government and who's going to be elected, it was always put in the boundaries of the economic management. But when we come to Indigenous issues, we always put that in the welfare basket. I said, well, no, we've got to change that. If we're really going to change the future for Indigenous people, the future for Australia, then we really have to have these people put in an economic management and economic development basket.
But we're going to see a number of quite large Aboriginal communities be extraordinarily rich.
Oh, they're going to become, over the next 10 to 20 years, they're going to become some of the richest people in Australia. You know, you're looking at massive projects that are going on. You know, like my background was in the gas industry, and we used to talk in tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. Now they talk in billions, and they're talking 40 billion, 20 billion, and that's only going to get bigger and bigger. So, you know, when you look at the Aboriginal communities that are working in this area and the development of Indigenous companies, then you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, and so these people are going to become very wealthy.
And how will that change the top end of Australia to suddenly have the great wealth of that area in the Aboriginal communities?
Oh, it's going to change it massively. You are going to see the infrastructure changes up there. You're going to see a massive growth of people working up there. I look at the Kimberleys, I look at Northern Australia, and I see, you know, the future cities of Australia. You know, you mightn't get to the levels of the Sydneys and Melbournes and that, but you'll get cities, you know, I can see cities the size of Newcastle and Geelong and stuff like that happening up in that area, because the development of that northern area is just massive. There is so much wealth there, not only within the mining industry, but just across the board. As we discovered recently with the cattle industry, everyone in Australia didn't quite understand how much Indigenous people are within the cattle industry. So when we had the kerfuffle with over the Indonesian abattoirs, a lot of those ones who were affected, in fact quite a few of them, were actually Indigenous run cattle stations.
What percentage of the employment in the mining industry is in fact Aboriginal?
It varies, but on a national level it's 5%. If you go to some places in Western Australia, it can go from 18 up to 25% of the mines are Indigenous. Then of course, then you look at the contracting. It's the same level with the contracting as well. In some areas, it's up to 25–35% of the contractors are Aboriginal. So it's a massive across the line. The mineral councils are looking at figures of it going up nationally again to about 9%, and we haven't touched the areas of the coal industry yet within New South Wales and Queensland. So when we start hitting that areas, it's really going to double over the next few years.
So what we're seeing is a much greater level of employment of Aboriginal people, both through contracting and direct employment, but then also in certain areas this enormous wealth. How will they handle that?
Well, that's the $64 million question, I suppose. In that we've got a
it's a $1 billion question.
The $1 billion question. We've got to really deal with the education system. There has to be reform within the education system. It is actually failing Indigenous people at the moment. The number of kids that we need to get through to high school, into the universities and within the trade section, it is minimal at the moment. We have to do a massive. It's not only talking about 100% improvement, but we're talking 300, 400, 500%.
When you have any group of people of any race or colour that suddenly move from a lower income exercise to one that's a higher income exercise, that creates enormous social problems and difficulties that are on the surface quite pleasant, but they can have some nasty repercussions.
Oh, we've got a history of that already. We've seen what's happened in the Northern Territory with the mines that come out of the 1970s and the 1980s and that, where a lot of money all of a sudden poured into these communities and that, and we've seen the devastation of that result. You've seen the alcohol and the problems that have been highlighted within the intervention. We've got to learn from those lessons now. It's about how we properly put in the infrastructure and massively the education system to work with people, as well as we need to start looking at people how they can get their governance right for their communities and get their governance right for their companies and organisations and that. So the next 5 years, it is going to be an enormous task for us as a nation to do that.
And how does the money get distributed? Who decides who gets the money?
Well, it's determined on the commercial arrangements they've done with some of the mining companies. In the past, we learnt the lessons of the past where they just said, okay, well, every year we're just going to distribute it out and people can do what they like with it. And we saw the dreadful devastation of that. So what people are doing now, they're putting them in trust accounts, or they're putting them in companies and organisations that will look at the education of the community, look at the infrastructure that needs to go into those communities, will look over an intergenerational approach. Okay, what are the people's children and grandchildren, where do we want them to be in 20, 30 years time? So there's a lot of work going into that, and we need to do a lot more. But
is there lessons from overseas, say from American Indians or the natives in Canada, as to how you handle situations like that?
Well, there are some very good examples. Canada's a good, and the United States are a good area. It's interesting that Canadians call themselves Aboriginals over there as well. It's they're probably about 10 years ahead of us because they had to deal with the oil and gas previously in Canada, northern Canada and that, and they've learnt those lessons, and we need to learn from them as well about how they're doing. They're setting up banking institutions, they're setting up financial services. It's about how they do their asset building with housing and how they educate their communities and that. So they're a good group to work with. And also, they're a similar society to us. They're still under the old, the British colonial system and that, their legal system and how they operate. And so that's one's good. New Zealand's another good example. The lessons, good and bad, that we can learn from those groups as well to move forward. And that's why there's a lot of Indigenous leaders now, a lot of Indigenous community people who are going to those countries, working with those the Canadian Aboriginal Indigenous Chamber as well. Working with the mining industry, the Aboriginal Mining Council over there as well. And so that's the type of lessons that we want to learn.
Do you think that, say, 5, 10 years down the track, the Aboriginal community in Australia, instead of being an area of great social service, will in fact be major taxpayers?
Well, that's what we're looking at. That's what we. Some people sort of like, well, how do we? It's funny that the conversations I'm having now is about how do we keep our taxes down, which is sort of like the rest of the general community as well. So I think that's great, and I think it's going to be a major shift for us. If you can imagine, 500,000 people in Australia, and we shift them from welfare into being contributors, economic contributors to the Australian economy, that is a major shift.
Oh, by the way, those payments from the mining companies, are they taxable?
It goes through the normal taxation processes. There's a paper that was put out last year by Nick Sherry when he was the Assistant Treasurer on how benefits within the native title area and mining area, specifically looking at, should be the taxation regime. I never thought I'd be in the position where I'd be sitting down with tax lawyers and tax accountants and having these negotiations. But it's funny, we have through the Indigenous Chamber, plus with the National Native Title Council and the Mineral Council of Australia, we're working with the government, negotiating that process through about how this taxation system should work.
This is an enormous change, isn't it, in the Aboriginal community? To go from where we are, where we've just been, into an area of prosperity, and managing that prosperity is without precedent, really.
It has its goods and bads. The good part is it's happening, and there's a lot of good things that are doing. The bad part is that we've got to bring out the whole part of our community with us, because a lot of people can be left behind, and we could end up repeating some of the bad of the past. So we've got to learn from the bad of the past and the good. We've got to now focus on how we can shift all the community forward, how we can develop our businesses, how we can develop our people, because for most people, the simple change of an economic status is just by having a job. So it's how we can educate and drive forward.
Do you think that the old style Aboriginal culture will gradually take a back seat as these changes come through?
It's actually going hand in hand at the moment. There is a change, and like with any society that goes through such economic growth in such a short time, there is a change. But we're trying very hard to do the positives out of that, so that you'll sit down and have these interesting conversations with Aboriginal elders, which 20 years ago I thought I'd never be having. They're talking about the globalisation of their communities and how they should be talking with China and India and other global leaders, and then the mining communities of Canada and so on. And they sit down with the Tom Albanese's and the Marius Kloppers of the world, and so it's quite an interesting conversation. It's quite an interesting growth you see, and also the shift in the past. Some political parties, and like the Greens and so on, thought that Aboriginal people were in their pocket. Now they're finding there's a big movement in the Aboriginal community about uranium mining, and
they want it, obviously.
Yeah, they want it. In fact, when I was president of the Australian Labor Party and we changed the policy, the free mines policy, that was a massive push from Western Australian Aboriginal communities in South Australia, because they had worked in the uranium industry and they saw it as an economic plus for them, and how they were going to use that as fun. So those interesting conversations, and a wide range of other things. I'm looking at a couple of people now who are moving up in the investment banking world. You've got about 1,000 Indigenous people graduating from universities now, and those people are going to, within 10 years, will be the movers and shakers. And I look at people today and I look at the future and I say, if you think some Aboriginal leaders today are pretty good and pretty groovy, wait till you see the next generation.